talked about how girls are taught to be small and that you have to raise girls differently.
But actually, I think when I was that age, I was observing. I don't think I had quite articulated the ideas. When I was older, I started to make sense of them with language.
First time that I saw, and I can remember the moment, somebody observing that I would not do as well because I was female. A friend of mine, a guy who's a still good friend, came into my room. He picked up one of my essays from the floor, which had been marked. He looked at it, and the bottom, it said, this is very good, it would get a first-class result. And he looked at me and said, what, you get a first? And I thought, the only way he thinks that I would not get a first is because I'm female. He knows nothing else.
Mary Beard has been variously described as the UK's national treasure. And the book behind you, Mary Beard, Women in Power, was a best-selling book on both sides of the Atlantic and beyond. And it's about a history of silencing women's voices. And Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, we should all be feminists. She splits her time between Nigeria and the United States and is a best-selling author, and her other books include Purple Hibiscus, Half of a Yellow Sun, and America. And we're both so pleased to have both of you here today. And Mary, you've been described as someone who's, at least here in Britain, that it's okay to be smart. And that it's good to be known by your ideas. And that has resonated, particularly with women of all generations, including this next generation, but with men as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the turning point was when I did one of my first television programs. And there was a very famous, extremely hostile review in the Sunday Times by A.A. Gill. You know, what the hell, you know, can't she do something about the way she looks? You know, if she's going to come onto our television screens, you know, she might as well, you know, she better primp up a bit, you know, she looks 16 from behind and 97 from the front, and why did she not get something done about her teeth? Also, when you read something like that, you think this isn't about me. This is not, again, this is not really about me. You know, this guy is sounding off about something he doesn't like that I represent. And I got a huge amount of support, and it was an interesting kind of turning point in women in telly in this country, actually, because, you know, the idea that, you know, you could have middle-aged, grey-haired women as well as middle-aged, grey-haired, craggy blokes on the telly was only just starting. And the thing that resonated with women across the generations was when I kind of at one point just replied to say, I was then 55, not 63, I said, what do you think a 55-year-old woman looks like? She looks like me. Right? If she doesn't look like me, she's had work done, right? Now, you know, some of us just want to look like we're 55. We don't. The Daily Mail readers, they said, right, you know, you can look like us and still be in front of a camera, ladies. Great.
Chimamanda, in your own way, I mean, it's an issue of your identity, who you are, and this has also resonated through your work. And from what I've read of you is that your identity, you feel it differently when you're in the United States and when you're in Nigeria, about not just who you are, but how people relate to who you are.
Yes, I think when I'm in the US, the identity I took up there and that I felt was thrust on me was blackness. It was a racial identity, which I hadn't thought about in Nigeria because I didn't need to think about race in Nigeria. I was too busy thinking about so many other problems. But really, race is not one of it's not an identity marker in Nigeria. So in the US, I became black. I became a black woman with all of its attendant stereotypes. And it was a learning experience for me because I'd come from a place where black achievement was not remarkable. But in the US, it seemed to be. And it's interesting because the story about the essay that Mary tells, I have a similar story, but in this case, it wasn't gender, it was race. So it was a professor in my first class.
In the United States,
yes. Who said, who wrote this essay? We'd sent in the essays by email, and I'd used my initial and my last name. And so I think my last name isn't quite, I don't think it's that obviously African or black. And so when I raised my hand, he looked really surprised.
Oh.
And it was a very tiny moment, but it was one of those moments that was just clarifying because I thought, oh, right, that's what it means to be black in America.
So how did that feel? Yes.
I really thought he was silly. I just thought, what an idiot. You know, he really is surprised. But again, it was possible for me to say that because I don't have the history of African Americans, you know, that it would have been a very different experience for me if I had that. Back in Nigeria, I do not think about race. When I get off the plane in Lagos, I don't think about race. But then I'm so much more aware of gender. And in Nigeria, gender is very much in your face, which in some ways can be refreshing. People will say to you, for example, oh, a woman cannot be president of this country, right?
In Nigeria? Or
Yes, they'll tell you in your...
And in the US too.
In the US, they are thinking it. They're not saying it as often.
I think it's really interesting what you say about thinking that somebody's remarks like that or surprise is silly, because I think that quite a lot of modern feminism has traded on outrage. And I think outrage is good in its place. I think, outrage gets things done. But I think that somehow an awful lot of the stuff that we face is laughable. If we allowed laughter as one possible response to some of this,
I think that there's some people who can't afford to laugh.
Yeah.
And I've come to understand that because I too think that laughter is an appropriate response to some things. For me, it's laughter and rage. So I go...
The combo. It's the combo.
I go from laughing to just being enraged.
Yes.
And also sometimes being puzzled. Seriously. I mean, I just feel like, stories that have come out recently about you sort of walk into a man's office and he sort of then proceeds to unearth his organ. And I just think, it doesn't even make sense. What are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to bow down?
Yes.
Seriously.
Yes.
The good thing about laughter is it's always, 99% of the time, it's an assertion of power.
Now, both of you are very interesting because if I can say as a BBC correspondent, so sort of a factual statement, both of you are much loved and appreciated for your writing and what you do, what you're good at. But you both, and as we've been hearing, have had to deal with years of your critics. And yet both of you have, I think, decided is on the balance between engage or ignore. You have a different response. Chimamanda, you're nodding. How do you deal with that? Because everyone here, I'm sure in their own life, has to deal with a certain measure of what we're talking about.
I think I mostly ignore. I try to be very careful what I let in. And so I'm not on social media.
At all? You don't do anything? Instagram, Twitter, Facebook?
Nope. I have an Instagram thing, but that's just for my fashion. And it's handled by my niece. I don't have the emotional space for that. I want to read poetry and write fiction and think about things.
Mary now goes to their house and invites them to lunch. Yes.
But my husband says that to me. He says, put that Twitter away. He says, just put it away.
So tell us about your philosophy.
Because I follow Mary and admire her and I read her and I'm just puzzled, both puzzled and admiring of her approach to it, in her willingness to engage. Because I see some value to it.
But there must be success in it, Mary.
This is why you... I mean, I've had, as I think most women who ever put their head above the parapet have had, I've had threats of rape, of dismemberment, of murder, the full gamut. And that sounds rather kind of nice compared to how they actually put it, And from the very beginning, I found myself thinking, after a little while, when people said to me, oh, just block them and don't respond. I did that for a bit and I felt quite uncomfortable because I thought, look, I'm interested in women speaking out, and what you're telling me to do when someone threatens me in some unpleasant way is to shut up. Well, women have been told to shut up for the last 2,500 years. And, I've had enough of this. So I kind of then just broke through that. And I thought, right, I'm going to reply. And I'm going to reply politely. And I think 99.9% of the time I managed that. And mostly, if you say, look, I'm sorry, I didn't actually say that. If you go and read it again, I think you'll find I was making a different point. Now, if you say that, 50% of the people that you're replying to will say, gosh, you're right, I'm terribly sorry, I was feeling angry. you know? And you come to see that most of these, and they're mostly guys, but not all, I think, most of these people who really attack you on Twitter are sad, not bad. Or they're drunk, or they're disinhibited, or it's late. And they're taking it out on the anonymity of the Twitter sphere. And you just happen to get in the way. And if you kind of say, excuse me, guys, person here, and I didn't say it, the majority will sometimes become your friends. I did it to one guy, and he said some extremely nasty things about my private parts and how they might smell. And I said, I think it might be an idea if you just took it down. I meant the tweet, not anything else. And he didn't. Then somebody said, it's got to be a conversation. And somebody said, look, I know his mum. I think she'll get him to take it down. And indeed, the tweet soon disappeared. Looked like happy ending. Until he then decided it got into the newspapers. He came to Cambridge, he took me out to lunch, he apologised face to face. Which I think is pretty brave, you know? And he came, and everything looked super until he tried to get a job. I had to end up, and I did quite happily, writing him a reference, writing him a letter of recommendation. Eventually got a job, and he's now long.
Okay.
In responding, I'm struck by your being polite 99% of the time. And why? Why are they deserving of politeness? And also, I think that there's something about that is also gendered. That idea that a woman, so while we push back against the idea of a woman being silent, in some ways, it seems to me that we are the stereotype of the woman having to be nice. Why not just say F you to them, right?
I see that, and there is quite often a temptation to say even worse than that. But I think for me, it's a bit like what you're saying about laughter. You know, it's politeness as a mechanism of control. I am not going to show that you've really got me cross. I'm just going to say, I'm terribly sorry, I don't think you have read what I wrote correctly. And I have to say, I think in some ways it's the most patronising and aggressive thing. You know, politeness can be extremely aggressive. You know, they expect you to say, oh, F off, you nasty little, you know, whatever. And instead you say, look, I'm terribly sorry, but I think you're wrong.
Any questions from the audience?
What would you say to parents out here who've got sons? How do they tackle everyday feminism?
Well, I mean, I really think that we need to allow boys to be vulnerable, to teach boys to be vulnerable, to give them the language of emotion. And I find that in reading about different cultures, it cuts across everywhere, this kind of masculinity that we have constructed. And I think it's just terrible for boys that when a little boy falls down, still, very often, he's not expected to cry. That little girls get more sort of love and hugs. And I think boys need to get as much hugs, and that we should expect vulnerability from them. And I think also we need to tell girls that it's okay for boys to cry. Because that's something else that the expectations of women, I think, sometimes hold back the behavior of men.
I'm Rose Gottemuller. I'm the Deputy Secretary General at NATO. So very interested in your comment that I'm very careful about what I let in. And I'm very mindful that Malala Yousaf made a similar comment. What is common, I think, in both your cases is that you keep your eye on the prize. And don't you think in the end of the day, that's the best advice, to keep your eye on the prize and let all that other stuff go by the wayside? I'd be interested in what Mary thinks, too.
I wouldn't feel comfortable engaging. I don't know how to do that in a way that's useful. And there's so much I want to do. There's so many books I haven't read. I have a huge pile, and I want to get through them. But also, I just wanted to say, most of Mary's critics, she said, are mostly men. Mine are not just men, they're men and women. And I mean on the subject of gender and all of that.
It is hard to know what gender they are on, on Twitter,
Yeah.
and I've concluded that the very nasty ones are male, but maybe that's my rationalisation.
Yeah, I think it just might.
It may be. Yeah. It may be. But I think that for me, the engagement is part of what I do. And I suppose I come back down to the idea of, my day job is as a university teacher, and I argue with my students, and when they don't get it, quotes, right, I engage. Yes. And I don't really see... I know all the reasons why Twitter's different, but actually, when somebody says something to me that I don't agree with, I answer back.